Hello, I'm going to continue from where I left off with the stories Luke tells, they're not in any of the other Gospels, about Jesus' childhood. I'll start reading from the NRSV as always, from chapter 2, verse 21. After 8 days had passed, it was time to circumcise the child, and he was called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. When the time came for their purification according to the law of Moses, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, as it's written in the law of the Lord. Every firstborn male shall be designated as holy to the Lord. And they offered a sacrifice according to what is stated in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves, or 2 young pigeons. And this is followed by a guy called Simeon prophesying over Jesus. So on the 8th day, they circumcised him. Perfectly routine for any Jewish boy, of course. The author here is at pains to surround everything with this devout Jewish atmosphere, with all the rituals being properly carried out on Jesus. The atmosphere is completely different from the rest of Luke's Gospel, which leads to speculation that perhaps these first couple of chapters were added later. There's no proof about that either way, unfortunately. And then, when the time comes, Mary has to be purified. The rule was, if you had a boy, you were unclean for 40 days. And if you had a girl, you were unclean for 80 days. That perhaps gives an indication of the depths of misogyny in these ancient cultures. It's as though the woman was being punished for having a girl. Something which is very difficult to get your head round from a 21st century perspective. But they go up. They sacrifice a poor man's offering, a couple of doves or pigeons, which has to be offered for the firstborn son. The roots of this probably lie in human sacrifice, way back before the exile. We've got indications of it in the law, and indications in Kings, where there's a place called Topheth in the valley of Hinnom near Jerusalem, where sacrifices are carried out in the translation to Moloch. Apparently Moloch, which has been mistaken for a god, is a word for a type of human sacrifice. So they were offering their sons, and it's obvious that the people who wrote Kings, doubtless some of the Jerusalem priests, absolutely detested this practice, and the place was purged and desecrated during Josiah's pogrom against everything non-Yahweh worship in Jerusalem. And then it doesn't appear again, and there's a lot of stuff in the law. It keeps coming up. Oh, no, 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 you mustn't sacrifice your sons. You have to sacrifice something else instead. And there's a series of different sacrifices you can offer according to what you can afford. The official one is a sheep, but if you're poor, you get away with a couple of pigeons. So they go to the temple. I'm not sure what you did if you didn't have access to the temple, if you lived a few hundred miles away, say, but I'm sure they developed ways of getting round it, which eventually became formalised in Rabbinic Judaism. But here, Bethlehem's a few miles from the temple, it's easy access, they just go up and they do the sacrifice, and off they go. Mary is once more ritually clean and doesn't have to abstain from anything she'd normally do. And then, after the prophecies, we continue. Chapter 2, verse 39. When they'd finished everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. That's interesting. Earlier, we heard that they had to go to Bethlehem for the census, because that was where Joseph's family originated. Now we hear that their own town is Nazareth. So why wasn't the census carried out there? Of course, Nazareth is in a different jurisdiction under Herod Antipas, and Quirinius' census wouldn't have been carried out there at all. Such are the historical confusions of the beginning of Luke's Gospel. But they returned to Nazareth. The child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favour of God was upon him. Now, every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents didn't know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travellers, they went a day's journey. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they didn't find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for them. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, his parents, not his step-parents, no mention of any virgin birth here. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." He said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know that I must be in my father's house?" But they didn't understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. So, Jesus is now 12 years old. It's the age when you start to take a bit of responsibility. It's the age when a modern Jew will have his bar mitzvah, or bat mitzvah if it's a girl. But there's no indication that the bar mitzvah had actually been invented at this date. And of course it was conventional in writing the biography of a notable figure, whoever it might be, that they'd give accounts of what a precocious kid he'd been. It's just a regular, it comes up every time. Here's Luke, writing for Gentiles, influenced by their style of writing about these notables, whether it's Augustus or Alexander the Great or whoever it happens to be. They have precocious childhoods. Here's Jesus having a precocious childhood as well. I don't think there's very much more to it than that. And there he is, sitting in the temple, surrounded by the teachers, displaying wisdom beyond his years. Wisdom, of course, is a characteristic of God. It's not something which humans can't have, though, of course, Paul is extremely unimpressed with words of human wisdom in the 1 Corinthians. But it's a characteristic of God, his Sophia in Greek, which is sometimes thought of at the time as a sort of divine emanation, an extension, if you like, of the divine, which can be present on earth while God's up there sitting on his heaven on his throne in the third heaven. They believed in a series of extensions, his logos, his word, which was like the active presence of God in creation, his spirit, his wisdom, his mighty arm, and so on. And so we see a glimpse of the divine present in Jesus as he sits asking questions from these learned teachers, shown as somebody who's eager to learn about the law, which of course he'd have to be an expert in order to be a credible religious leader later on. Undoubtedly Jesus will have picked up an education in the law somewhere along the line. We don't know how or where. Very likely he learnt it off the Pharisees, who were the popular religious leaders. And of course the New Testament routinely agrees with Pharisaic interpretations of the law, however much it criticises them. But here we see in Luke's writing a glimpse of that. And when we see him next, it'll be as a grown man. The Gospel accounts, Matthew and Luke, disagree with each other on a very deep level. To my mind, they're completely incompatible. The church, of course, part of our modern culture, is much concerned with harmonising, evening things out, renegotiating awkward passages, just as the Israelites renegotiated human sacrifice into animal sacrifice some centuries earlier. It's something religions have to do. But what interests me, first, last and always, is the text rather than the story the church tells, or stories, because you hear different versions very often in different churches. I'm often disappointed by the way churches use or abuse the sacred text, if we want to call it the Word of God or a holy text or whatever. I've always believed we need to take it extremely seriously. I've always tried to do that. But the church so often treats it as little more than a source of proof texts, little out of context snippets it can use to legitimise whatever it wants to say. You can read anything you like into the Bible with that approach, and what I'm trying to do here is counteract that a bit and bring out what these texts actually say, even if it's awkward, even if it's not what we want to hear, even if one text disagrees with another. If we want to call the thing the Word of God, then we need to look seriously at these stories as they were originally told in the text and start from there as a basis of whatever interpretation we need to do for the 21st century. I think next time I'll look at the creation stories. Now we've looked at the birth and childhood of Jesus. I did a degree in geology, and then became a Christian not so many years later. Made the mistake a lot of people make and joined a fundamentalist church, and was immediately faced with young earth creationism, which as far as I'm concerned is nothing but a conspiracy theory. I was told that dinosaurs were lies, scientists are liars, we don't know anything about dinosaurs, but we have the truth, so we don't need to know about anything. And that is classic conspiracy theory material. So let's go back, look at the creation stories plural. There's 2 long ones in Genesis and several briefer mentions throughout the Bible, and see what they're really saying. So I'll stop there and start working on my Genesis stories.